So just to introduce myself, I'm Martin McDowell. I'm the chairperson of the North of Ireland Family History Society, and I'm also one of the co-admins of the North of Ireland DNA Project. So we've been working quite heavily in terms of DNA for the last 12 to 14 years, and we've been making great progress in Ulster. Our society covers the 9 counties of Ulster. That's why we're called North of Ireland and not Northern Ireland. And we're not being politically correct by that title. It's just that we are covering the whole province of Ulster. I'm also the DNA representative on the executive committee of the Family History Federation. That is a UK body that supports family history societies across the UK. I've got the job of trying to promote DNA across the whole of the UK through that. That's really enough about me. So I'll get on to the presentation and I'll just share my screen now. I hope you can all cope with the accent. There's not much I can do about that if you can't. I'll try and speak as slow as possible so as you can understand me. But today I'm going to be talking to you about geographical DNA projects. And this is something that we've been using to great effect in the North of Ireland. And this is why I want to talk to you just about what we've been doing, our approach, and what we've achieved out of it. This is quite an innovative idea. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to test people in bulk whose ancestors came from a specific area or place in Northern Ireland. We're trying to find then a group of people, find the connections between this group, and then find other connections to this group around the world in the database. So the database that we're using for this work is Family Tree DNA, and that is where our North of Ireland DNA project is based. We currently have almost 11,000 members in that group. One of the good things for us is that an awful lot of people are tested through the same company, and that is giving us a good way to compare the actual tests because the same points have been tested for everybody, and that improves the quality of the testing. We want to use Family Tree DNA because it is a company that people have been using in Ireland from almost the beginning. We also need a company that provides a chromosome browser, so that is ruling out the likes of Ancestry there. And when we started this, MyHeritage wasn't yet selling DNA kits. So the vast majority of our work is done within the Family Tree DNA platform. And we find that it's particularly strong for Ulster because of a lot of the work that we have been doing over the last number of years. So we're trying to grow our family trees backwards and sideways. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find these connections. Now, in Ireland, we have probably got an 1800 brick wall in most of our lines. And this is because of a lot of records were destroyed in the fire in the Four Courts in 1922 during the Civil War in Dublin. And this meant that a lot of precious records went up in smoke. But there is lots and lots of other smaller sources that can be harnessed and used. And this is what we're trying to do. So we're trying to get really good at using family history sources, and we're using them in conjunction with DNA. And the overall benefit is that we're getting further than what we ever could have done by just using DNA or just by using family history. So it's the combination here. So what we're trying to do is set up different projects to examine different things. So again, as you will probably know, we're getting our DNA from our 5 times great grandparents. So we're getting little segments of DNA passing down from most of these ancestors. And then these shared segments of DNA are showing that we have a common ancestor with our matches. So one of the important strategies that we're using in these geographical projects is that we're bringing funding to the table. And that's crucial because what we're trying to do here is not just pay for people's tests where they would test anyhow, but we're trying to get into the local community and get people to test who wouldn't otherwise test. Now, this is crucial because what we're trying to do is get people who are not interested in family history, but may be interested in participating in a project such as this. So it means that by providing funding, people are not worried about paying for a DNA test that they're only mildly interested in. It also means that we can offer to manage the kits on their behalf. And that means that we have access to the DNA information that we're paying for, but it also means that they don't have that responsibility that they don't want of having to respond to matches, probably because they don't fully understand their own family history and don't have a deep interest in it. We're using a combination combination of different types of DNA. We're mostly using autosomal, but we do use X, Y, and mitochondrial as much as we can. And really what we're trying to do is build up a DNA profile of that area. And this allows us to compare with people who have tested all around the world and to maybe help people in the US or Canada or Australia find out that their ancestors emigrated from Ireland and they may only know Ireland from the US Census, but our type of a project might help people to identify that they have DNA from a very specific area of Ireland. This is something we have achieved on many occasions where we can look at somebody's DNA and we can see how many people they're connecting to in a small geographical area, and we can almost call it straight away that people have ancestry from one of our project areas. So where are our projects based? So Belfast is around there on the map, and our first project was set up just before lockdown. So about 2017, 2018, we started a project in Ballycarry. Ballycarry is a small village in Antrim. We call it the Ballycarry project, but it's really based on all of the townlands in that particular parish of Temple Corran. But we called it Ballycarry because it's the more recognizable name. So what we did was we set up an eligibility criteria. We investigated all of the local families. We looked at gravestone inscriptions. We looked at old wills. We looked at birth, deaths and marriages, all the other sources that we could use, land records, and we built up family trees for all of the families that lived in this particular area. And then what we did was we held a public meeting, and this is crucial where we have to get the public on side, and we spoke to people, told them what we were doing and encouraged them to participate. By that stage, we had done some fundraising and we had used that money to buy DNA tests. We brought them with us and we asked for volunteers at the end of the night to do a DNA test for us. So one of the things that we insisted on was that we needed to know their ancestry in order to realize if this kit was one of interest to us or not. So unfortunately, we do have to sometimes say, no, we can't fund that kit because you don't have ancestors from the desired families that we're looking for. And what we have realized now is the best strategy to do is to have other kits there available for purchase, because what we have found in subsequent projects is that people are very keen to participate. If they don't meet the strict criteria for that project, they may be interested in purchasing a DNA test themselves and then seeing who they match, because by getting more tests in that area, you are making the benefits a lot clearer. So we did a lot of work in Ballycarry and we tested quite a few people, but then COVID hit. And one of the problems that we had was that we weren't out engaging with the community in the same way, and potential testers were starting to dry up for us. So we decided what we wanted to do was to extend a project and do a project in a different part of Ulster. Now, we had initially thought that we would go somewhere else and maybe do a different county, but what we found was that because we had done Ballycarry, now Ballycarry is, as I said, about there on the map, and this little peninsula there that you can see in County Antrim is actually Island Magee. So what we thought was we would do Island Magee, which has 23 townlands. We thought we would do that. It's the parish right next to Ballycarry, and the reason we did that at the time was because a lot of people in Ballycarry also had ancestors from Island Magee. So we already had quite a good database of people with Island Magee ancestry. So we thought that rather than go somewhere different and start again, we would just roll over into the next parish and extend the work that we had done and make it sort of one big project. So that's what we did. And because we were able to do this during COVID, we already had that good starting position. So we did a series of talks on Zoom. And then once we could, we got out into the local community and we then spoke to people. We held public meetings. We even go to local events like craft fairs where we're able to engage with people on a one-to-one basis. And we do now have some contacts within the Island Magee. And if we then come to that person and say, well, we're looking for someone who is a great grandchild of this particular couple, then this person is very good at turning us up potential testers. We can also source Y testers, mitochondrial testers, and we're looking at the time for specific lines, and we're trying to get good coverage of all of the families that lived in Island Magee in the 1800s. Now, out of the 5 projects, Island Magee is by far the largest. It's been very well embraced by the local community, and we've probably funded around 200 tests within Island Magee so far. And this isn't always people who live there now, because people qualify it for the free test if if their ancestors came from there and if we can verify their family tree. So after doing these two big society projects, we decided then to extend this into our local branch network, because our Family History Society is made up of 9 local branches. So we found that 3 of our local branches were very interested in doing their own smaller but local DNA projects. So the first of these to be set up was our Ballyeaston project. And Ballyeaston is again in County Antrim, around there. Some of you may know that the earliest census that survives for Ireland is 1901. We have a complete 1901 and 1911 census. And before that, we have just small extracts of census material that survives. So we're not like England or Scotland or Wales, where they have comprehensive census back to 1831 or 1841. So with Ballyeaston, we found that there was a church census had been done in the village in 1813. Now that's a very early census for the British Isles, and it's one that we knew in our Family History Society was not widely known about in the local community, and it also wasn't widely known about in the genealogical community. So we thought if we did a project based on the census document, then what we could do is we could look at the families in that census document, try to work those family trees down to the present day, and then if we looked for connections between the descendants of those families, we're hoping that we can then work those family trees back from the 1813 census into the 1700s. And this would give us information that doesn't currently exist in paper records. So that's been our approach in Ballyeaston. And again, we had a very successful meeting in one of the church halls in Ballyeaston, and we found that people travel far and wide to attend. We had a great response to our testing, and we also found a lot of people opted to buy their own DNA tests because they wanted to be able to manage them themselves, and they also wanted to participate in what we were achieving by getting more people from that area into the family tree DNA database. So that really helped us to move things forward. So this church census has over 2,000 people named on it, and they're arranged into 588 families. Those different families all show the head of the household, his occupation, and then the relationship of everyone else and their ages to the head of the household. So we had all these little mini families, and we've been able to maybe prove that particular people in these census records were brothers and sisters. We have also been able to turn up old wills that were held privately, because in Ulster, well, really in Ireland, the first official will to survive is about 1858. And from 1858 on, we have a complete set wills for Ireland, but all of the wills before that, well, the vast majority of them were destroyed. But we do know which wills existed because we have an index to those wills. So again, that will index can be very useful to us. And we do find some records that have turned up. I'm going to be talking about an 1818 will book later on in this presentation. And again, we have found that some of these wills that no longer survive in the public record are actually held locally in people's attics. So these projects have turned up additional wills, and there's genealogical information in those that has not been shared with the genealogical community. So we have found wills for Ballycarry, for Island McGee, and also for Ballyeaston. So that's again been a side product of our genealogical projects that we didn't really expect, but new information has turned up. We had a memorabilia day recently in Island McGee where we invited people to bring family Bibles and other photographic material that they have on their ancestors, and then we were able to look at that and they were able to share it with other people. So the first two that I've mentioned there, Ballycarry and Island McGee, they're geographical projects. Ballyeaston, although it's geographical, it's also based around that census document. And then we did a cemetery project in Belfast City Cemetery, and this is just really looking at people who are buried in Belfast City Cemetery and trying to find links between the descendants of the people in that particular document. So we are lucky to have a complete record of all burials in Belfast City Cemetery from 1869, and they're available for free on a website. And then what we can do is we're trying to gather all of this information together, and then we're using that as a testing platform to see if we can try and encourage more people with Northern Irish ancestry to test. And that has also been a very useful way to publicise what we're doing in our society. Then our Killyleagh branch last year decided that they wanted in on the act and they wanted to do a local project project in the town of Killyleagh. Now that has taken us then into County Down, and Killyleagh is probably, if my geography is right, is around there in County Down. So again, what we're doing in Killyleagh is we're trying to get people who have ancestors from the families that lived there in the early to mid 1800s. We're trying to get their descendants to test. And then we have got other people in the branch to research these family trees. We're then trying to put these trees together, and then we're trying to link the testers together through DNA, and then try to find the genealogical information that links these two trees together. So it's a very good way to publicize DNA, to publicize our genealogy work, and also to get both working in tandem. So that's really what we are trying to achieve. So how does this benefit us? Well, really what we're trying to do is get people to test who wouldn't otherwise do so. We do have some farmers who have tested for us who don't even have computers. They don't have email addresses. So there's no way on earth they're ever going to do a DNA test. So what we're hoping to do is to widen out the spectrum of people who are currently testing and engage with the community to get more testers. We also did another project in our to fund 80 free tests for anyone who was over 80. So we just went out to the general public and we said, if you are over 80, or if you know someone who is over 80 who would do a DNA test, well then we would be prepared to pay for that test to encourage you to do a test. And the idea is that those people are going to be maybe one generation higher than the majority of our testers, and that means that everyone is going to get better matches if we can build up that database with people who are unlikely to ever test themselves. And what we find when we take that approach is that people come and they're maybe brought by their son or daughter, and then their son and daughter comes into a research centre and says, oh, that sounds really interesting, I would like to test too. And then they test, and then they have half their DNA from their parent who we're doing the test for, but they also have half their DNA from another parent who may now be deceased. So this helps us to build up our database and get a higher percentage of testers in Ireland. And what that's achieving for us is that we're getting more DNA into the database, more points of comparison, and this is helping us all to get through our brick walls. We're also now able to prove many of these lines back into the 1700s, and this is allowing us to confirm connections maybe just by DNA alone. And this is the real power of this. When you have enough people tested, you can tell, you can walk these segments back and you can see where these segments are coming from, what line they're coming from. It's not just a matter of knowing it's on their paternal side, but it's also knowing which 4 times great grandparent this is through. And sometimes it is complicated when we're finding multiple connections between people, but it's something that we are managing to handle. And how we're doing that is sometimes we may find 3 segments shared between a couple. We might find that 2 of these segments we can prove to one genealogical relationship, and it may be that a 3rd segment is coming from a different genealogical relationship. But we have strategies in place to track this and to try to work alongside this and deal with what we're getting. And then that's keeping us on the right path for future testing and for future analysis. So this is helping us to increase awareness in the local community of how DNA works, and it's also enabling us to produce results that we can then present back to the local community and to groups within our own society as well. But we find that this is giving people a sense of connection within a community as well, and we're helping other people around the world to identify that specific locality that their ancestors came from. So they have been side products of what we're doing. And I think the more of this work that can be done, both in Northern Ireland and in other places, I think this is the way that we can move DNA projects further on, and we can all benefit from this. Just to give you an example of what we have achieved so far, we are taking note of all of the matches that we can confirm, and we're only doing this on our funded kits. So we have found well in excess of 1,500 confirmed matches so far. And what we're finding is that these matches that we're proving are getting further and further out, because that's what we're looking to achieve. We're not really looking to prove that 2 cousins are cousins, because they know that, we know that. That's not really challenging us in terms of DNA. But what we're trying to find is we're trying to find people who maybe share 5 times great grandparents, and that may have been 1 or 2 generations out of reach of most of these testers if they had just tested on their own without all these other comparison kits to compare to. So So we're very pleased to find 6 cousins. It's something that most of us in Ulster aren't able to do on our own. So these extra tests are really, really helping. But what we're also doing is we're finding that we are finding matches where the common ancestor is as far back as 1717. I think that's the earliest one we have found yet for autosomal DNA. There could well be earlier ones that we haven't yet been able to prove, but we have got a proven one back to 1717, and we have many that are going back into the mid 1700s. It has also helped us to identify the maiden name of unknown mothers, and how we're doing this is if we find 30 or 40 matches that are all coming down through one particular 4 times great grandparent, well then we can make a very educated guess that it's not coming from the father's line, that it is coming from the mother's line. And then if we have 30 or 40 testers with a different surname that all have one genealogical root at the top, we can then realize that that is connected to this other family in some way. Yes, it can be maybe one generation further back, but we're looking at the size of the segments, the numbers of the SNPs within those segments, and we're making judgments based on other genealogical information in order to assess and to try to build these trees up, or at least give ourselves a best guess towards these family trees. And we've been very good at finding additional siblings for people who live in the late 1700s or the early 1800s, where we can prove that this other group of testers has connections through both of the parents. In many of these cases, our baptism information may not start until the 1830s or the 1840s. So we're maybe working with people who were born in the first decade of the 1800s, and their marriages are going to be before certification in Ireland, and the first marriages recorded in Ireland for civil registration were 1845. So therefore we don't have a record that gives the father's name alongside that record of marriage. So this is why sometimes it's very useful for us to be able to add additional siblings. Now, we're doing all of this work when we don't have that core information in terms of marriages or baptisms, and the potential for a geographical project in other areas where this information is available is immense, because you would be able to prove a lot more matches straight away, and then you could use what you have to work it back even further. So we are still working in the early 1800s because dearth of records at that particular time, but it is still benefiting us in ways that we couldn't otherwise benefit from. And our research is being shared publicly, and this is another way of engaging with the local community. We're publishing all of this on Wikitree, and we're allowing people to see at all stages what we're doing. We're adding on profiles for all of the people that we're researching in these research projects, and then people can go on and see their own family trees on Wikitree, and this is useful to them. As we can then find additional links at tops of these trees, we can then connect people together, put in research notes to explain it, and also then let people see that they have connections to other people in their community, and then explain those connections as so as they know how they're connected. So this is what we do, for example, on Wikitree. We have a project homepage, and we have organized a little way where we're taking people through an introduction, telling them about the location. As you can see, there's Island Magee's been circled on the map. Then we go through the population, the different surnames of the area, a little bit of the history, and then we're showing different links. And this is the type of thing that we do. So we have a category for anyone who was born or died in Island Magee. And then what we do is we put on anyone who's got an ancestor from Island Magee. We have a page for the earliest known ancestors who are pre-1800. Then we have all of the different graveyards, and we categorize people into the graveyards there as well, so as they can then see where their ancestors were buried. And we do have an individual who's been helping us, who's went around all of the graveyards in Island Magee and photographed every single gravestone, and we're uploading them onto the Wikitree pages as well. Then we have worked out which surnames were there in the 1800s and 1900s, and we have a criteria for that. And then you can see that some of them here are not in bold. That's what we started with. So we started with all of these surnames, and when we got an autosomal tester, we made them bold so as we could see the ones that we now have got. But then if they go red, it means that we have got a Y tester and an autosomal tester. So it's a way of tracking our progress in all of the surnames that were there at that particular time. So you can see there, we're still looking for a Davison or a Davison without a D, and we're looking for an Esler, we're looking for a Laverty, a McLennan, and a McCrae. But we've got McCalman, Grant and Hagen and Kane and Brennan and Ferris, and we've got Y testing for all of that as well. So when we can afford it, we then upgrade the autosomal test to either a Y or a mitochondrial test if we deem them to be useful to the project. And again, we would try to fund them where possible. But again, sometimes our project members have said, well, we're very grateful to get an autosomal test from you, but we're happy to pay for the big Y. So we have got people who have done that as well, which is very good. And we get other people who then donate to our project work and have supported us with money in order to help us buy additional testing within the Islandmagee and Ballycarry projects. So I'm going to give you now 4 examples of what we've achieved, because I've talked in general about what we're doing. I'm now going to get into specifics of families and just give you an idea of how we have moved things forward. So this is our first example. It's about the Bradford family of Craigenea. Now, Craigenea is not in Islandmagee and it's not in Ballycarry. It's in the adjoining parish of Glyn. So it's north of Ballycarry. And this is a family that we had got some links to on our general wider North of Ireland DNA project, but we didn't realise that they had any connection whatsoever to Islandmagee or to Ballycarry. And what we found was there was an 1818 will book, and that's one of the will books that was destroyed in the Four Courts fire in 1922. But we found that it had only been partially burnt. And what had happened was the partially burnt pages had been transcribed by somebody, and they had created this new resource, which was 357 partial wills from the year 1818 and 1819. Now, I was astounded to find this, because even though I was involved in the genealogical community, I had not yet heard of this resource. And I spoke to many of my colleagues, and this had passed them by as well. So sometimes these new resources come along. This was actually online. This was something that we could use. And when I looked through this, I was able to find that some of these wills were for people in our project areas. So we found people from Ballyeaston in this book. We found people from Ballycarry in this book. We also found people from Islandmagee. But this particular example is taking us back to Islandmagee. And we found the will of Jane Brennan, who was born in 1733 and died in 1818. Now, we know that she was born in 1733 because there was a gravestone that survived for her. But all we had was a gravestone inscription. We knew she was in that grave. We knew her husband was in that grave. But we didn't know how they connected to anyone else in the whole of Ulster. We just had a gravestone inscription that was totally unconnected. So therefore, what this will provided was the genealogical information that connected Jane Brennan to the wider community. And we found that Jane Brennan, although she lived in Islandmagee, well, we found connections with the Bradfords of Craigenea. And this is where a family had left Islandmagee and they had moved to the parish of Glyn. So what we're now able to do is connect a family that are no longer in Islandmagee, but we can connect them through genealogical sources and also through DNA to another area of Ulster. And this is the type of thing we're trying to do over and over again. This is an example of what the partially burnt will look like. And this is the beginning of it here. It's quite small. I know you won't be able to read this, but it just starts with the will of, and again, this was burnt. So we know that this is Jane Hill alias Brennan, and it was late of, but we didn't have Islandmagee. So how we could put these little bits in, and this was done by the person who transcribed it. What survived here was the will number, and what did survive as well was the index to all of these old wills. So they could look up 1707 and they could see from that other source that this was the will of Jane Brennan of Islandmagee. So that's why that's in curly brackets, because that bit did not survive on the original page. And then you can see in the name of God, I, and then the rest of that line is missing. And then you have ing of the parish of. So you're not getting of the parish of Islandmagee, which is what probably would have been written there. So you can see here, as the will goes on, there starts to be information that can be used. My daughter Bell, you might be able to see there. So it's telling about bequeathing to my son-in-law William Bell. So there's information contained within that. So we looked through that. Obviously, we didn't get every single word of the will, but there was enough information surviving that we could use that to build up a tree of Jane Brennan. And then, as I said, we could use things like gravestone inscriptions to work out what age they were whenever they died. And this gave us more information that we could base around this basic tree. And this gave us the parents and grandparents for Samuel Hill Bradford. So it turned out that that Jane was I think it was his maternal grandmother. So we also found then, as we worked on this family, that some of this family had emigrated and some of them had moved to Australia. And when we looked at their marriages and their deaths in Australia, we were able to get the names of both parents because they were routinely recorded on the marriage and death certificates in Australia. So that was very useful. So Samuel Hill Bradford was our brick wall ancestor because at the beginning, he was born in 1810. He married before 1845. So we had no way of telling who his father or mother was. And it was only by putting this will together with the information we had on Samuel Hill Bradford, and then we could find out where his middle name came from, because the Brennans married into the Hill family, and that also gave us that link. So the family tree then allows us to add other connections, and the DNA is proving that all of this is correct. I've got a little tree here to show you, and this is what we've managed to put together. So James Hill, we know his name, and we only know his name because he was buried in the same grave as his wife. We know that Jane was a widow when she died in 1818, but her husband's name was not mentioned, but we got that from the gravestone inscription. And then she mentioned a number of her children. She mentioned a James. We haven't yet been able to extend the tree for James, but she did mention a daughter, Ellen, and we know that Ellen married John McGowan. Now, this is 1778, and he was born in 1785. And we have been able to work this tree down to the present day, and we have DNA connections, quite a few of them, below this point here. So this is bringing us down to Alexander Erskine, who was born in 1898. And 2 generations lower than this, we have a number of DNA connections. Then we have another child here. So we have Fanny Hill, and she married Hugh Bradford. Again, this is a marriage that we could substantiate through wills, through information on death certificates and gravestone inscriptions, and we're putting all of this together. We now know from the will that Jane was the grandmother of Samuel Hill Bradford. So it's through his mother, Fanny Hill, back to Jane Brennan. So this is his maternal grandmother's maiden name. Now, how useful is that for DNA descendants and for looking for surname matches for the DNA descendants that we have down from this particular family? And again, we have multiple DNA connections down from this particular couple here. But then we could prove that Samuel Hill Bradford had a brother called Hugh. And again, this is the family that went to Queensland in Australia. And we've been able to build this family down. And again, we have linked people who have tested in the database that are descended from that particular branch. So now we've got a framework. We've got other children that we haven't yet got DNA descendants from. We've got this James Hill. We've got a Betty Hill that we don't know anything about, a Sarah Hill. We've also got a Belle Hill who married somebody called Brown, but we don't know, again, exactly what that line is. But we do have a number of testers that go up into the Brown family in Island McGee. So we're hopeful that we will be able to link this particular branch in at some point. And then over here, we have got an unknown female, and we only know about her because Jane mentioned her son-in-law, James McMaster, in her will. We know that McMaster was also a well-known name in Island McGee. So we hope to be able to extend this family. But again, this is the late 1700s. We do have McMaster trees back to about here. So what we have to do is maybe try to analyze some of those McMaster trees and find shared segments with the descendants of these particular people, and then rule out any other potential connections that there may be. So I hope that's given you an example of how we're using our geographical projects to further the information and to extend trees that probably haven't been documented from the early 1800s, and we're now trying to recreate them. So moving on to example 2, and this is one that we found early on in our Ballycarry project. I've got a little update on this one today, but it is one that really showed us the power of our geographical projects fairly early on. And what we had here was we had a very good tree that we could build back to William Orr and his wife Margaret Semple McAlpin. You just can't see the full surname there. And they were born in the late 1820s. And we very quickly found 9 people who we could prove genealogically and through DNA were descendants of. And this gave us a genealogy of the Orr family that was written in the 1820s, and it goes back into the 1500s. Now, we didn't know that this was accurate, but we've been doing some testing on that, and I'm going to be talking about that in a moment. But through our genealogical research, we could see that William Orr's father, John, had a sister, Margaret, and that she married into the Miller family. And we found a match here coming down from this couple that was matching matching with multiple people in this particular group, and we found shared segments between third and fourth cousins. That was proving this link for us and giving us a link back to this couple here, Alexander Orr and Margaret Symington, who were born, he was 1746 and she was 1761. So this is again something that we had early on, and then once we used these Orr pedigrees, we were able to work out more. So this Ulster pedigrees has given us more information on this particular couple. So if I just go back to the previous slide, you'll see Alexander married a Margaret. We already knew that from the gravestone inscription, but what we now knew from the Orr pedigrees was that Margaret's surname was Symington. We also know that he was married before, and we have details of his first wife and 2 children that he had with his first wife. We also know he had a niece, Mary. We know how they're connected, and we know that she married James White, and we are now looking for descendants of that couple. Now, that has been something I thought we might have achieved by now, but unfortunately all of their descendants seem to have moved out of the local area, and we have struggled to find any descendants who have tested of that particular family, and we haven't been able to target test them because we can't bring that tree right down present day to identify testers that we could potentially test, because they're no longer in that local area and we don't know where they've went to. But we also found that Alexander Orr was the uncle of James Orr, who was one of the famous bards. He's called the Bard of Ballycarry, and he was one of the poets of those days, and he was quite well known, and his poetry is still well known and respected in those circles. But the other thing we got from this Ulster pedigrees is we got 6 more generations of direct ancestors from Alexander, and this took us back into the late 1500s. Now, obviously we didn't know if these were correct. We have probably reached the limits of autosomal DNA because we're already back at 1746. We could maybe push it 1, possibly 2 generations further back, but that would mean we'd have to have an awful lot of testers and would need to analyze the DNA very carefully to make sure that we were following the right path. But these 6 generations are a lot more easily tested with Y-DNA. So we've been very lucky in that we have a member of our society who has been doing a lot of work on this particular document and this particular family. So they've been verifying connections between the Ulster pedigrees. They've been looking at the original notes that were used to construct those in the 1820s, and our member has already found additional information. He's found new information that was either deliberately or accidentally left out of the first version of this. He also found some mistakes where people had been confused and the numbering was wrong in the Ulster pedigrees document. And then we've been doing big Y testing to try to confirm the structure of the tree above 1746. And what we found was that when we go back to the tree, I'll just show you there for Alexander, well, one of the descendants that we have here is actually called Orr. So we could test him by big Y, and we could then come right up this line through William Orr and John Orr to Alexander Orr. And then what we wanted to do was test other people that are mentioned in the Ulster pedigrees and see if they matched the same group and see what time period we got recommended through big Y testing. And what we found was that we were able to find that one of the descendants of Alexander Orr, we've got an 8 cousin match that is now through the Ulster pedigrees and proved through big Y testing, and the common ancestor is born in 1651. So what we're hoping to do with this is to confirm the structure of that particular document, and this document brings in all different lines. It's not just about the Orr surname, it also mentions lots of them of the maternal lines and who they married into, and all of these other surnames that fall out of this tree that's coming down from 1585. But it's really, really useful to have big Y verification of this document. And then what we can do is we can look at the different branches of this tree and look at them from the 1700 on and see if we can flesh out these particular areas of the tree with autosomal DNA testing. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment. And by extending tests across Northern Ireland, we're able to tease out more of these connections and find that people have Orr ancestors that they may not even currently be aware of, but we may be able to link them into these tree branches. So that's another way that we can use what we're doing in our geographical projects. Okay, moving on to number 3, and this is a slightly different example. So when we were doing testing, we came up with this particular person who tested through our Ballyeaston project. Now, they had a match of 229 229 centimorgans. And what this gave us was a very good match, probably around second cousins to the person whose match list I'm currently showing you. But the problem was they had no surnames in common. We had a tree that was taking them back to their 2, 3, and 4 times great grandparents, but this was probably a second cousin match that was coming through great grandparents, and there was no matching surnames whatsoever. This is always what we find when we're doing DNA. We find these mystery matches. We don't know how to cope with them. And just when I'm on this page, before I go on any further, I just want to show you the family matching tool that we use on Family Tree DNA. So this particular tester had 13,253 matches at the time, and we were able to divide a number of those matches up into paternal and maternal. It's automatic bucketing that we're able to do by linking confirmed matches to the tree, and this gives us the ability to separate our matches into paternal and maternal. It's not done the ancestry way, it's done a proper way through chromosome analysis. So we're aligning these segments and these matches to particular sides of our family, and then anyone who shares those segments of DNA is also attributed that colour, either paternal or maternal. This is the first stage that we use when we're trying to analyse these matches, because we can then attribute them to one side of the family. So I could tell for this tester that this match was on their maternal side, but I didn't yet know how they matched, and it was 229 centimorgans. So this led me back to the DNA, and I had a pretty good idea that this was something that had happened in Ballyeaston. They didn't have a common surname, but they had one common ancestral place, and that was the village of Ballyeaston, because Ballyeaston's a very, very small place. So we found no match in surnames. We found that connection of Ballyeaston, and we found that they both had ancestors. One had an ancestor called McConnell, one had an ancestor called Miller. They were both called John, and they were both shoemakers. So we thought, well, there's something to go on. When we started to look at the local parish baptisms, we found that there was a couple of interest to us. John Miller McConnell was born in 1820, and he married Eliza McKinstry in 1850. We knew that they were the key to solving these problems. And what we found was that after they married in 1850, their first children were all baptized under the surname Miller. Now, Miller was John's middle name, not his surname. So that's a very odd choice. But we were able to prove through DNA that all of these children surnamed under Miller were the children of John McConnell, and they were also the children of Eliza McKinstry. Now, this was the first time I'd come across this, but this is why I just thought it's an unusual example, and that's why I thought I would mention it today. We then found that the later children were all baptized under McConnell, and that seemed to change in the mid-1860s. They started to use the surname McConnell within the family. But the real benefit for us, we did find one child was baptized in the middle of these two groups, and the surname was given as Miller or McConnell. So that was a very clear link that all of these people were the children of the same couple, and we didn't quite know what was going on here. But the really interesting thing is that although all of these children were the same generation, and we could prove through DNA that they all had the same parents, their descendants are both using the surnames that they were given at the time. So some of those families are still using Miller, and some are still using McConnell, and they seem to have forgotten the connection between them. All of these children were baptized in the 1850s and the 1860s, but for some reason they were using this. Now, I have speculated a potential reason for why this may have happened, and what I think was going on was that at the time this was a small village. John McConnell was born in 1820, but his father was also a John McConnell. I think the Miller was his mother's maiden name, and I think that's why he got it as a middle name. So I think that maybe he was referred to locally as John Miller to avoid confusion with his father, who was John McConnell. Now, the father died around the mid-1860s, and I think at that time John Miller McConnell reverted to his actual surname and not his known as surname. So he started to baptize his children under McConnell, and in the census records he's actually still living in Ballyeaston in 1901, and he is using the surname McConnell at that stage. So he married under McConnell, he was in the census under McConnell, but all of the baptisms in between, they were earlier ones were Miller, and then the later ones were McConnell. So we don't expect to find situations like this. I suppose we don't know for sure why this happened at time, but in reality it was useful for us to be able to use the DNA to identify identify that these two people were second cousins, and then we could find this explanation for why they actually matched. So it wasn't that someone was illegitimate. It was a full second cousin relationship where they shared ancestors, but both people had different family trees. One said Miller and one said McKinstry. And this is just a little example of all of the households at time that were living in Ballyeaston village. I think some of the numbers were abandoned houses. So I think at the time there was about 41 houses in Ballyeaston. And in household 15, we found John and Elizabeth living there under the surname of McConnell. So that is the John Miller McConnell and Eliza McKinstry, who are mentioned there, who are the parents of this particular family. In household 10, we have another McConnell household, and this is their son Robert. But in house 39, we have a Miller, and this is their son John, who had been baptized under Miller, and he continued to use the surname Miller for the rest of his life, and he passed that on to all of his children. So we found 3 second cousins. If there was any doubt that everybody was related the same way, we also found someone who was related through a brother of Eliza McKinstry, and this was given a third cousin relationship, and they matched all of the testers, both the Miller testers and the McConnell testers. So we could prove that the same parents were held across all 3 of these second cousins, who came down through 3 different children of John Miller McConnell and Eliza McKinstry. So I hope that is showing you how family history can be confusing, but also how DNA can sort out the issues for you. So this is my final example, and this is how we have been combining Y-DNA and autosomal DNA. And we've used this, and it has really thrown up some curveballs for us. So in the case of Cameron is a family that we found quite a lot in the area of Island McGee, and we found 2 large groups of autosomal matches, and we found about 20 different testers in each of these 2 big groups, and we found that within these clusters lots and lots of people matched each other, but there was very few people that matched across these 2 groups. So we had got it in our heads that this was 2 very distinct Cameron families that probably ended up in Island McGee from separate places, and that there wasn't a connection between them. But when we did big Y testing, we chose 1 person from each of these 2 groups, and we expected to see that this was 2 different Cameron families. But what we found was that the big Y showed that both of these groups were actually connected, and we think it's just about 1 generation further back than the autosomal DNA is reaching for us. So we think that around the early 1700s, we think we know now how these 2 families connect. So we've got a theory. We haven't totally proved this yet, but we now know that these Camerons are all related to each other, even if we're not getting massive connections between these 2 groups of autosomal matches. But then in the opposite scenario, we had 1 big group of about 30 people who all matched together, and they all shared the surname Kane, and they all lived in Island McGee, and they were living in adjoining townlands. And the common feeling within the local community was that they were all related further back, but nobody really knew how. And when we did the same thing, we got 2 big Y testers from this group of 30 people. We found that there was 2 totally unconnected Kane families. They weren't connected within 2,000 years. So obviously the connection was not based in Island McGee whatsoever. So this meant that 2 different families, both called Kane, and there was various spellings of this. Sometimes it was C-A-I-N, sometimes it was K-A-I-N, and sometimes K-A-N-E, but it's normally K-A-N-E, which is why we're using that on the slide today. So when we looked at these, we found 2 distinct families, but then that didn't explain why all of the autosomal descendants of these 2 families were all matching each other. So we looked back at our autosomal DNA matches, and we found that in every case there was other lines that were coalescing. So we could find out sometimes it was maternal lines, sometimes it was further up the paternal tree, but it was branching off at a different point, but it wasn't coming through the Kane patrilineal line. So again, that was very good evidence, and again, by using Y-DNA, that's keeping us right, because in the Kane case it shows that people are not connected through their patrilineal line, and in the Cameron case it's showing us that even though we didn't think they were connecting on the patrilineal line, they actually were. So this is where we're combining different types of DNA in order to extend our knowledge and to make sure that we're sure of what we're doing at all stages in our geographical projects. So just to sum up now before I finish, this is really our project methodology. The really important thing is to get funding, to either fundraise ourselves, but we do a lot of initiatives in the local community. We try to raise funding to pay for this testing. Then Then one thing we want to do is make sure that everyone is tested the same way, so as to provide the best comparison that we possibly can get between testers. Because when you do an upload, what you're doing is you are uploading results from a different database, and that different database has chosen to test different points in your DNA. Now, that's fine for closer matches in the more recent generations, but what we're trying to do here is harness matches which are further and further back. So we're looking at 4th, 5th, 6th, and potentially 7th cousins. And in order to do that, we want a commonality of approach. So we want everyone tested through the same database. And we have lots and lots of local people tested with family tree DNA. And this is why it's the best testing platform for us. As I showed you earlier, we use the family matching tool. This helps us link matches and split matches into paternal and maternal sides. And in many cases, we can split the vast majority of the matches that we have because we have so many people tested that we can link so many people together. We then use the chromosome browser and we're looking for shared segments between people. But because we're using the family matching tool, we already know that if people align on the chromosome browser and they're all aligned paternal or maternal for that person, we know that it's not going to be a case of somebody matching on their paternal side against somebody on their maternal side. So these two tools are working very closely together for us and enabling us to be a lot more sure about our results. Then we're looking at xDNA. We're looking at any potential clues from Y and mitochondrial DNA. We're then uploading to GEDmatch, and then we're revisiting the family trees that we have, and we're looking for specific people that we want to test in order to tease out particular connections. And this could be through Y testing. It could also be through autosomal testing. But I will say we don't have anyone who is Y or mitochondrial tested that we haven't also done autosomally as well. Then we build all of this research onto WikiTree, and if we have found that someone has uploaded into our database in order to compare with our testers, at the beginning we were encouraging that, and we still do, but what we were doing was we were encouraging that, and if we knew that somebody had done ancestry, we were saying just do an upload, and that means we don't need to fund your test and we can use it for somebody else. Now that we have more money, we have realized the benefit of retesting people because we're getting more accuracy in these further back segments, and that's allowing us to find matches that we're not finding on people's uploads. So what we're finding is that when we retest somebody, if they've done an upload, then we're losing about 1,000 matches, but we're maybe gaining 1,500 matches. So we're losing some inaccurate matches and we're gaining lots more further back matches that should be more reliable for us. So I would encourage you, please do join our North of Ireland DNA project if you have ancestors from one of the 9 counties of Ulster, but also do consider retesting within family tree DNA. And one of the things that we find quite a lot is that people in the US and Canada and Australia, they're looking for Irish connections way back in the 16 or 1700s. Now, if you're uploading from MyHeritage or from Ancestry or 23andMe and you're uploading that into the family tree DNA database, it will not give you complete accuracy on those earlier matches. And for that reason, you're not going to have a proper comparison to all of the test kits that we're doing on family tree DNA. So this is why I would encourage you to consider retesting. At the moment of speaking here, the autosomal test on family tree DNA is only $39. So it's very affordable. And this is going to give you a way to harness what we're doing and to find if your connections came from Ulster, because you'll have a better comparison at those earlier points. And that really helps when you are looking at your match list. So thank you for listening, and I hope that's been of use. That's my email address if anyone wants to contact me about any of the contents of this presentation. DNA@nfhs.org.